There is a place in Utah where a railroad runs out onto open water and does not stop. No island under it. No riverbank. Just the dead-level surface of the Great Salt Lake stretching to the horizon in every direction, and a line of steel laid as straight as a ruler across the middle of it. For more than 50 years, the only thing holding that line above the brine was wood. Posts of timber driven down into the lake bed, mile after mile after mile, with trains 100 feet long rolling over the top of them. And here is the part that stops me. They did not have a single machine that could have built it the way we would build it today. No cranes barging concrete pylons into place. No steel caissons. They had axes and steam and floating hammers and 3,000 men who worked through the night under electric lights because the lake never gave them a place to rest. It is called the Lucin Cutoff, and it should not have been possible. I have been reading the records of how it was done, and the more I read, the more I understand why people came from across the country just to stand and look at it. Thomas Edison himself called it a bold piece of engineering and well worth seeing. He was right. But the records also keep a kind of silence that I want to be honest about from the start. We know the names of the men who ordered it and the man who designed it. We do not know the names of most of the men who actually drove the piles, who stood out on that water in the cold and the salt and did the work with their hands. The lake took their labor and gave back almost no record of who they were. I will tell you what the record does hold. And where it goes quiet, I will tell you that too. To understand why anyone would lay a railroad across an open lake, you have to understand the problem they were trying to escape. When the first transcontinental railroad was finished in 1869, the two great lines met at a place called Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake. That is where they drove the famous Golden Spike. It was a triumph, but it was also a compromise with the land. To get around the lake, the railroad had to climb up and over the Promontory Mountains. The grades were steep. The curves were tight. Helper engines had to be coupled on just to drag the trains over the hump, and then uncoupled on the other side. Every train that crossed the country had to fight that mountain. It cost time. It cost coal. It cost money on every single run, year after year, decade after decade. The numbers tell the story of why the old route was such a burden. The grades over Promontory reached 2.2%, which does not sound like much until you remember that a railroad lives and dies on its grades. A long train cannot pull itself up a steep slope on its own. As the trains of the new century grew longer and heavier, the railroad had to keep stationing extra engines at the foot of the mountain just to shove the trains over the top, then pull them off and send them back down for the next one. It was a permanent crew, a permanent fleet of helper locomotives, burning coal and time every hour of every day, all to fight a mountain. The railroad had only crossed in the first place because the men of 1869 had been in a hurry. The original line had been thrown around the north end of the lake quickly in a rush to claim federal land grants by the mile, and the country had been paying for that hurry ever since. The idea of crossing the lake instead was not new. As early as 1892, the head of the Southern Pacific had told his chief engineer to study whether tracks could be pushed straight across the water. A financial panic the next year killed the plan before it began. It would take a different man, a decade later, to actually do it. By the turn of the century, that man had decided he was finished paying the tax to the mountain. His name was Edward Henry Harriman. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Harriman had taken control of the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1901, and he was not a sentimental man. The Golden Spike, the famous old route over Promontory, none of it moved him. He looked at a map and he saw a straight line. From Ogden on the east shore to a tiny rail town called Lucin on the far western side, the lake sat almost exactly in the way. Going around it cost the railroad miles and grades it could never get back. So Harriman asked the question that sounds insane until you say it out loud. Why go around the lake at all? Why not go straight across the top of it? The man he handed that question to was William Hood, the chief engineer of the Southern Pacific. Hood was the one who had to turn a line on a map into something that would carry the weight of a moving freight train over 30 feet of salt water. And the water was the easy part to describe and the hardest part to solve. The Great Salt Lake is not a friendly body of water. It is far saltier than the ocean, saturated to the point where the brine eats at metal and crusts everything it touches in white. There is no fresh water for miles. The lake bed in the middle is soft mud that goes down and down, with no bedrock anywhere near the surface to anchor a foundation. You could not dig a footing. You could not pour a pier onto solid ground because there was no solid ground. Whatever they built, it would have to float its weight on mud, or stand on posts driven so deep into that mud that friction alone would hold them. Hood chose both. The new line, the cutoff, would run about 102 miles from Ogden to Lucin, and it would cross roughly 30 miles of the open lake. Where the water was shallow near the shores, he would build a solid embankment, a great wall of rock and gravel dumped straight into the brine until it rose above the surface. He would lay about 13 miles of that fill. And then, out in the deep middle, where the water ran 30 to 34 feet, and the embankment would have sunk forever into the mud, he would do the unthinkable. He would build a wooden bridge, not a short one. Almost 12 continuous miles of timber trestle, the longest such structure ever attempted, marching across open water on nothing but driven posts of wood. Think about what wood means here. To hold that trestle up, they needed piles. Tall, straight tree trunks, stripped and sharpened, hammered, point first down through the water and deep into the lake bed. And they needed a forest of them. The record gives a number that I had to read twice. To build the trestle, they cut down 38,256 trees. A forest of roughly 2 square miles, felled and shipped and driven into the bottom of a lake. The big timbers, the piles, and the structural beams were Douglas fir, brought in from the Pacific Northwest. The decking that the rails finally rested on was redwood, millions of board feet of it. They were not building a bridge so much as transplanting an entire forest into the salt and standing it back up. Some of those piles were so long that a single rail car could not carry one. The records say that for the longest piles, 3 flat cars had to be coupled and chained together just to haul one tree out to the lake. And if you laid all of the pilings end to end, the line of timber would have stretched roughly the distance from Chicago to Buffalo. That is the scale of the forest they drove into the bottom of the Great Salt Lake. Not a few hundred posts, a line of wood long enough to cross half a dozen states. The finished trestle itself was a careful piece of carpentry, not just a row of sticks in the water. The piles were driven 5 in a row, set every 15 feet, and lashed together with timbers 4 to 8 inches thick. On top of each cluster, they laid beams 18 feet long and a foot square. Then 11 long stringers ran lengthwise from bent to bent, and over those went a floor of 3-inch plank, 16 feet wide. The plank was given a thick coat of asphalt and then a foot or more of crushed rock ballast, so the rails would ride on stone the way they do on solid ground. And the whole thing was laid almost perfectly level. The grade across the lake varied by only about 5 inches in every 100 feet. The top of the ties stood at 4,218 feet of elevation, about 15 feet above the surface of the water, a wooden road floating 15 feet over the brine and running flat to the horizon. The tools they had to do it with were the tools of the age of steam. Steam pile drivers, 25 of them, mounted on floating barges that could be poled and towed out across the lake to wherever the next bent of piles needed to go. A pile driver is a brutally simple machine. A heavy iron weight is hoisted up a tall frame by a steam engine and then dropped. It falls, it strikes the top of the timber pile, and the pile is hammered a few inches deeper into the mud. Then it is hoisted and dropped again, and again, and again, all day, until the pile refuses to go any deeper, and the men know it will hold. There were 8 steam shovels for loading the rock. There were 80 locomotives moving material out along the growing line. There were close to 1,000 rail cars, including hundreds of special steel side dump cars built just for this job, each one able to carry 55 tons of rock and tip it straight off the end of the embankment into the lake. And there were the men. 3,000 of them at the height of it, with about 1,000 working out on the trestle itself, over the open water. Here is how the trestle actually grew, foot by foot, out into nothing. They worked from the end of the finished track. A floating pile driver would be brought up to the leading edge, and the crew would set the first pile of a new bent, standing it upright in its iron guides. The steam hammer would start its slow, pounding rhythm, driving that single tree trunk down through 30 feet of brine and on into the lake bed below. They drove the piles in clusters, 5 to a bent, set crosswise to the line of the track, and then they bound them together. Heavy timbers were laid and bolted across the tops of the piles. Long stringers ran lengthwise from one bent to the next, tying the whole structure into a continuous spine. On top of that went the ties, and on top of the ties went the rails, and then a work train could roll forward onto the new section and bring the pile driver one bent closer to the far shore. A good crew, working back to back, could set something like 75 piles in a single day. Then they did it the next day. And the next? For month after month after month. To move all of this across the lake, the railroad built itself a navy. There was a stern-wheel steamboat, fittingly named the Promontory, and 7 tugboats, and a scattering of smaller launches besides. This little fleet carried the supplies and the crews and the messages out to the working ends of the trestle, towing barges of timber and stone across miles of open brine. And the lake fought the boats the way it fought everything else. The salt crusted on the hulls and the decks and the machinery so badly that the vessels had to be docked over and washed down with steam just to scrape the salt off and keep them running. A steamboat named for a mountain hauling a forest across a salt lake, scrubbed clean with steam every few days so the brine would not eat it alive. And they did not only work in daylight. This is the detail that I keep coming back to. The lake offered no town, no inn, no warm place to wait for morning. So they brought the light to the lake. They strung electric lighting out along the works and even over the gravel pits on shore, and the crews ran in shifts around the clock, 10 hours at a time, day and night, Sundays and holidays, the steam hammers pounding under the glare of electric lamps while the rest of Utah slept. Out on the black water, in the middle of nowhere, there was a line of light and the endless sound of iron striking wood. The two halves of the trestle, one creeping east from Lucin and one creeping west from the promontory shore, drew closer and closer across the lake all through 1903, until the rails finally met out at a spot they simply called Mid-Lake in November of that year. Even water was a problem they had to solve from scratch. The lake was full of liquid, and not one drop of it could be drunk by a man or fed to a boiler. The salt would have destroyed the locomotives and the pile drivers. So they hauled fresh water in, 500,000 gallons of it, every single day, brought by rail from Death, Nevada, well over 100 miles away, just to keep the engines running and the men alive out on the salt. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The rock fill was its own kind of war against the lake. Where the embankment was meant to rise, those steel side dump cars rolled out to the end of the track and tipped their 55 tons of stone straight into the brine. And the lake swallowed it. The bottom mud was so soft that the rock did not simply pile up where it landed. It sank. It pushed the mud out sideways and kept sinking, so that they had to dump far more rock than the visible embankment would ever show, because most of it disappeared down into the lake bed to find a footing that would finally hold. The settling went on long after the rock stopped falling. The record says it took a crew of thousands the better part of 2 years just to chase the settling fill, dumping more and more rock as the embankment slowly sank and steadied and finally came to rest. They were not building on the lake. They were building down through it until they reached something solid. And then there was the salt itself, working on the wood. The brine of the Great Salt Lake is so concentrated that it did something strange to the timber. It pickled it. The piles standing in that water did not simply rot the way wood rots in a freshwater river. The salt soaked into the grain and preserved it, hardened it, and over the years it stained the submerged wood in deep streaks of red and yellow and black, and even purple, where the minerals leached out of the brine and into the fibers of the tree. Above the waterline, the white salt crusted on the timber until the whole trestle looked frosted, a line of white wood running out across a white-rimmed lake. The lake was trying to destroy the steel and the engines. But the wood it almost seemed to keep. I want to be honest here about the human cost, because the record is honest about how hard this was, and quiet about who paid it. The men out on the trestle worked over 30 feet of water that could not be swum easily, because the brine is so dense and so stinging. They worked in the cold, in the wind that comes unbroken across an open lake, in shifts that ran through the night. The pile drivers were heavy, and the work around them was dangerous. Iron weights falling, timbers swinging, footing always wet and always moving. Unskilled laborers earned around $2 a day. Skilled men earned $4 and more. There was no alcohol allowed in the camps. They ate and slept in work camps strung along the line, and they went back out onto the water. And when the records list the engineers and the officers and the company men, the men who actually stood at the hammers, mostly, are a number and not a name. 3,000 workers. About 1,000 on the trestle. The names did not survive the way the structure did. I wish I could read them to you. I cannot. That silence is part of this story, and I am not going to pretend it away. The work pressed on through 1902 and into 1903, the trestle crawling out from both shores toward the middle of the lake. And then, in the autumn of 1903, the two ends met. The last pile of the great trestle was driven in October of 1903. The line was complete across the open water. The first freight trains rolled across in early March of 1904, and that autumn the passenger trains followed. The Great Salt Lake had a railroad running straight across the middle of it. But first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one unless enough people click. One click. Come back. The payoff was exactly what Harriman had seen on the map. The cutoff was about 102 miles long, and it cut roughly 44 miles off the old route around the lake. More than the miles, it killed the grade. The trains no longer had to climb and fight over the promontory mountains, no longer needed helper engines hauling them up and over the hump. The line across the lake was almost dead level and almost dead straight. Coal and time and money that the railroad had been spending on that mountain every single day, for decades, simply stopped being spent. The whole project cost something on the order of $8 million, an enormous sum for the time, and the company made it back in the running, run after run, year after year, on a railroad that finally went where it wanted to go instead of where the land allowed. And the old route. That is the quiet tragedy folded inside the triumph. The line over Promontory, the line where they had driven the Golden Spike in 1869 and finished the first transcontinental railroad, the most famous stretch of track in the country, suddenly led nowhere the main line needed to go. The through trains abandoned it almost at once. The last regularly scheduled transcontinental passenger train rolled through Promontory Station in September of 1904, the same year the cutoff opened, and after that the old summit was a backwater. The place where a nation had celebrated being stitched together coast to coast was bypassed by a straight line across a lake. For decades, the rusting rails over Promontory just sat there, slowly forgotten, while the trains ran out over the water a few miles to the south. The end of the old line came in the middle of the next great national emergency. In 1942, with the country at war and desperate for steel, the Southern Pacific tore up the original transcontinental rails over Promontory and gave the medal to the war effort. They held a ceremony for it. An unspiking, they called it, in September of 1942, the deliberate opposite of the Golden Spike that had been driven there 73 years before. They pulled the last rail off Promontory summit, and the steel that had carried the first trains across America went off to be melted down for the Second World War. The cutoff across the lake had not just bypassed the old route. In the end, it outlived it and helped erase it. One quick note. I turned the full story of the Lucin cutoff into a book. Everything the records gave me. All the names and all the numbers. If you want it, the link is in the description. The wooden trestle itself carried the traffic of the nation for half a century. It saw the railroad through 2 world wars and the Depression and the long boom after. By 1908, there were already 5 passenger trains and 7 freight trains crossing the lake every day in each direction. The whole heavy traffic of the western route running out over the open water on those timber piles. It was not all triumph. The lake that the men had conquered could still turn deadly, and the worst day on the trestle came in the middle of the Second World War. On the last morning of 1944, a thick fog lay over the Great Salt Lake. A Southern Pacific passenger train, the Pacific Limited, was crawling east across the trestle at about 18 miles an hour, full of soldiers and sailors heading home. Behind it, in the same fog, came the mail and express section, moving much faster its crew unable to see the lights of the train ahead until it was far too late. The express plowed into the back of the passenger train, out on the wooden bridge. 7 cars were thrown off the trestle and down into the briny mud and shallow water of the lake. Around 50 people were killed, many of them servicemen, in what remains the worst railroad disaster in the history of that part of the country. The straight line across the water had its own quiet graveyard, out in the fog where the timber met the brine. But Wood, standing in a corrosive lake with a single track and constant maintenance, was always living on borrowed time. By the 1940s, the company could see the end of it. The trestle was a choke point, only 1 track wide, and it cost more and more every year just to keep it standing. So in the 1950s, they did to the trestle what the trestle had done to Promontory. They replaced it. Beginning in 1955, the Morrison-Knudsen Company built a solid earth-fill causeway parallel to the old wooden bridge, a great rock embankment running the same line across the lake. At the height of that work, they were pouring something like 40,000 tons of rock into the lake every single day. The new causeway was finished and carrying trains by the end of 1959, at a cost of around $50 million, far more than the original. The trains moved over to the rock. The old wooden trestle was set aside, restricted, and finally left alone. That solid rock causeway did something the Erie wooden trestle never had. It walled the lake in two. Where the trestle had stood on open piles and let the water flow freely underneath, the new embankment was a nearly solid dam running clear across the Great Salt Lake. The rivers that feed the lake all empty into the southern half, so over the years the two halves drifted apart. The southern arm, fed by fresh water, stayed bluer and far less salty. The northern arm, cut off and starved of inflow, grew saltier and saltier until it reached near saturation, and in that brutal brine, a tiny salt-loving algae, and the microbes that live with it turned the whole northern water a deep wine red. To this day, if you look down from an airplane, you can see it. A blue-green lake on one side and a red lake on the other, split by a dead straight line. The line is the railroad. A crossing built to shorten a rail trip accidentally divided a lake into 2 different colors, and it has stayed that way for more than 60 years. For years it just stood there beside the causeway, 12 miles of abandoned timber crusted white with salt, slowly going silent. It was not torn down right away. It was left to the lake. And here is the strange and almost gentle ending to the story of all that wood. In the 1990s, the salvage rights to the old trestle were sold to a lumber company, and over the years that followed they took it apart and brought it back to land. The brine that had pickled those piles for nearly a century had turned them into something that does not exist anywhere else. Douglas fir and redwood soaked in salt and stained through with red and yellow and purple from the minerals of the lake, hard and dense and strange. Something like 30 million board feet of it was reclaimed, the timber that had stood over the open water of the Great Salt Lake for nearly 100 years. Today that wood lives on, in floors and beams and timbers in homes and buildings, the actual trees that were felled and driven into the lake bed at the turn of the century, the actual structure that 3,000 men built under electric lights in the dark. The forest that was transplanted into the lake came back out, one streaked and salt-hardened beam at a time. I keep thinking about the straightness of it. That is the thing the photographs never quite carry. A line of wood and steel running out across open water until it narrows to a point on the horizon, dead level, dead straight, in a place where the land said no foundation could ever hold. They did not have the machines we would use. They had axes and steam hammers and floating barges and 500,000 gallons of water hauled across the desert every day. They had the night, and they brought their own light to it. And they had 3,000 men whose names the lake kept for itself. The famous golden spike up at Promontory is the part of this story everyone remembers. But a few miles to the south, on the flat white surface of the lake, ordinary men did something stranger and harder and, in its quiet way, more impossible. They laid a railroad straight across the water, on wood, and for half a century, it held. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out and upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.